It was supposed to be a happy moment. James had been counting down the days, eagerly awaiting his wife, Laura's return from her business trip. They hadn't been apart in weeks, and this trip had felt longer than it really was. They'd texted, spoken on the phone, and he couldn't wait to see her again, hold her in his arms, hear about her trip. But as he stood at the airport terminal, waiting for her to walk through those gates, the excitement in his chest started to turn to something unfamiliar, something darker. He scanned the crowd, looking for her familiar figure. Laura always stood out, her tall frame, the way her auburn hair cascaded around her shoulders. And there she was, walking toward him, a soft smile already spreading across her face as her eyes met his. James' heart leaped in his chest. The world felt right again, and everything else faded into the background. But then, something caught his eye. She wasn't alone. Standing next to her was a man, significantly younger than James. His arm was casually draped around her shoulders, and they were laughing together, as if they shared a secret. James froze. His stomach sank. At first, it felt like a punch in the gut. What was going on? James blinked, trying to shake off the strange unease that settled over him. His eyes locked on the young man's face, and there was a familiar kind of intimacy in the way they stood close to one another. The way his hand rested on her waist. The way she tilted her head back, laughing, clearly at ease. A part of him hoped that maybe he was overthinking it, that maybe this was nothing, a simple misunderstanding. But another part of him, a deeper, more primal part, was already starting to piece things together. Was this someone she was working with? He wondered, but the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach told him it was something more. Laura caught sight of him and her smile faltered for just a moment, but she quickly masked it with a casual wave, as if the younger man standing beside her was nothing out of the ordinary. The man beside her, with that easy, too comfortable grin, looked over at James and gave him a nod. His casual manner made James' blood run cold. He tried to smile back, but his stomach was in knots. James didn't know what to say. What was he supposed to feel? Relief that his wife was home? Or anger, confusion, and betrayal flooding him all at once? "Hey, babe," Laura said, walking towards him. She seemed too eager, too calm. "This is Chris," she added casually, introducing the man at her side. Her tone was warm, almost too warm. "He's a colleague from work. We spent some time together while I was away." James stared at her, his mind spinning. "A colleague," he echoed, trying to keep his voice steady. Laura nodded, her smile still there, but now it seemed forced. "Yeah, he's really great. We've been talking about some of the projects at work." But James couldn't shake the image of them standing so close, so at ease with one another. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just a friendly colleague. There was an undeniable chemistry between them, something that his wife hadn't shared with him in months. His mind was racing, and the questions started to flood in. Why didn't she mention him before? Why was he at the airport with her? Why had they been so familiar with each other? For a moment, James just stood there, speechless, watching as Laura and Chris exchanged a look, one that lingered a bit too long. Babe?" Laura said, her voice breaking through his thoughts. "Are you okay?" James blinked, his heart pounding. The smile on Laura's face seemed to be fading, but he couldn't look away from the connection between her and Chris. His world tilted. And just like that, everything he thought he knew was crashing down. What was really happening here? And why did he feel like he was standing in the middle of a scene he wasn't meant to witness? James and Laura had always been the picture of a perfect couple, or so it seemed. They met in college, both ambitious and driven, with big dreams and shared values. Their connection was instant. James had admired Laura from the first moment he saw her, her intelligence and sharp wit drawing him in. They both came from small towns and found solace in each other's company. It wasn't long before their friendship blossomed into something more. They moved in together after graduation, and soon after, they were married. For the first few years, their lives were filled with laughter and joy. James often said that they were the kind of couple that made people believe in love. They traveled together, celebrated every anniversary, and enjoyed the simple pleasures of shared moments. Life seemed perfect. Of course, like any relationship, they had their ups and downs. There were arguments over finances, the pressure of work, and the occasional bout of dissatisfaction. But they always seemed to find their way back to each other, reinforcing their bond each time. They communicated well, understood each other's needs, and genuinely enjoyed spending time together. But in the last year, something had shifted. James didn't want to admit it at first, but he began to notice that Laura was becoming distant. At first, it was subtle, small changes in her behavior that he brushed off as stress or work pressure. Laura had always been the more outgoing one, taking on multiple projects at work, being the center of attention at social gatherings, and spending time with friends. But as time passed, James noticed she became more absorbed in her career and less present at home. The late nights at the office became more frequent, and weekends that were once spent together started slipping away, replaced by personal time or trips that seemed spontaneous and without explanation. James asked her about it once, casually, over dinner. "You seem a little distant lately," he had said, trying to be gentle. "Is everything okay?" Laura had laughed it off, brushing it aside with a quick, "I'm just swamped at work. You know how it is." But despite her reassurances, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had started pulling away, not just physically but emotionally. The passionate kisses they once shared had turned into quick pecks. Their conversations became less intimate and more functional, just talking about day-to-day responsibilities, bills, or the weather. There were moments when James tried to reignite the spark, planning little surprises, picking up her favorite flowers, or setting up date nights. But every time, she seemed distracted or uninterested, often claiming she was too tired or had too much work. Deep down, James felt the disconnect but didn't want to acknowledge it. He tried to ignore the voice in his head telling him that something wasn't right, telling him that this was a phase, and that things would return to normal. A few weeks before the airport incident, Laura had mentioned a work trip she needed to take. It was to a conference in another city, and while James had initially felt uneasy about her going alone, she assured him it was just a short business trip, nothing to worry about. She was leaving for just a few days, and James, wanting to be supportive, encouraged her to go. "It'll be good for your career," he said, trying to be the understanding husband. She left on a Thursday afternoon. James gave her a hug and kissed her goodbye. He was excited about having a few days to himself, thinking he could get some work done, catch up on his hobbies, or even just relax a little. But as soon as she left, the house felt emptier than usual. It wasn't long before he started noticing the small things. She had left behind her favorite sweater on the couch, and the smell of her perfume lingered in the air. The silence felt oppressive. James threw himself into his work, trying to stay busy. He sent a few texts to Laura, checking in, but the responses were brief, nothing like her usual thoughtful replies. It was as if she was trying to hurry the conversation along, a part of him suspected. At first, he told himself that she was probably caught up in the conference, meeting new people, making connections. That's what she had always wanted, right? To climb higher in her career. But as the days wore on, he began to feel a subtle unease. Laura hadn't called him in the evenings as she usually did, and when she did text, it was often only a sentence or two, almost mechanical. He wondered if something was happening behind the scenes, if she had become too engrossed in her work or was overwhelmed by the pressure of the conference. Still, he dismissed it, telling himself it was nothing. By the time Laura was scheduled to return, James had already prepared a welcoming surprise for her, flowers, a nice dinner, and a little note that said, "Welcome home. I missed you." He was eager to see her, to reconnect. He even began imagining all the things they could do together once she was back. But over the course of those few days, James began to notice the oddest things, details he hadn't paid attention to before. Laura's behavior, though subtle, had started to feel more distant than usual. He couldn't help but wonder if she was hiding something. The odd, almost unnoticeable changes had begun to add up. There was something about the way she had acted before she left for her trip, something about the distance in her voice, the way she avoided his gaze during their last few conversations. Then there were the messages. It was nothing overt, just a few strange, cryptic texts Laura had received late at night. They weren't from her usual contacts, nothing alarming, but still, a nagging voice told him it wasn't right. He didn't want to invade her privacy, but the small, lingering doubts started to eat away at him. What if she was seeing someone else? What if the work trip had been just an excuse for something more? James had never suspected Laura of cheating before. He trusted her, loved her deeply, and she had always been honest with him, at least, he thought so. But as he replayed their interactions over the past few months, everything felt like it was slipping through his fingers. And then came the day he went to pick her up. The moment he saw her, standing next to the younger man at the airport, the truth crashed into him like a wave. It wasn't just the way she laughed with him or the familiar intimacy they shared. It was everything, the way they stood together, the way their bodies leaned into one another, how comfortable they were in each other's presence. There was no mistaking it. The way Laura looked at him, the way Chris looked at her, it wasn't the relationship of a colleague and a friend. James couldn't breathe. He stood frozen in the crowd, watching as his wife, the woman he thought he knew so well, stood with another man. And not just any man, a younger man. A man whose closeness to her seemed to be more than what was appropriate for a professional relationship. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know whether to walk up to them, to confront them right there in front of everyone. But the words were stuck in his throat, and his body felt numb. Everything he thought he knew about their life together was being ripped apart in front of his eyes. As Laura and Chris approached, their smiles faded as they noticed James standing there, eyes wide in disbelief. Laura immediately turned to him, her smile faltering for just a moment. It was subtle, but it was enough. She wasn't just surprised to see him, she was startled. Her face flushed for a second before she quickly tried to mask it with a nervous laugh. "Hey, babe," she said, walking toward him. "This is Chris, I told you about him, right?" She sounded almost too casual, too rehearsed. James barely managed to nod, his gaze flicking back and forth between Laura and Chris. Chris, the younger man who stood next to Laura as if he had every right to be there, gave James a small, almost smug smile. The air between them felt heavy, suffocating. "Hey, man," Chris said, his voice smooth, almost too friendly. "Great to meet you. Laura's told me a lot about you." James stood motionless, his thoughts a blur. His heart was hammering in his chest. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond. Everything in him wanted to scream, to demand answers. But he didn't. He just stared at Laura, waiting for her explanation, hoping that somehow, she could make sense of this twisted reality. As Laura tried to explain, her words blurred into meaningless noise. James wasn't listening anymore. His mind had already started to break apart the puzzle in front of him, and he wasn't sure if he could put it back together. How had he missed this? Why hadn't he seen the signs? The confusion was overwhelming, and the pain of betrayal started to sink in. But the story was just beginning. The airport terminal felt suffocating. The sounds of the crowd faded into the background, and all James could hear was the pounding of his own heart as he stood frozen in place, staring at his wife, Laura, and the younger man, Chris, who was standing far too close to her. The confusion, the anger, the overwhelming sense of betrayal threatened to overtake him, but he stayed still, gripping the strap of his bag with white knuckles, too stunned to act. Laura, who had once been the woman he trusted completely, was standing there with someone else, laughing and joking as if nothing was wrong. Chris's arm was casually draped over her shoulder, his hand resting on her waist as though they shared a private joke only the two of them understood. James couldn't look away. As Laura turned to approach him, her face fell slightly when she saw his expression. Her smile, the one that had once made his heart soar, faltered for a split second. James, Who is he, Laura? James's voice was colder than he had intended, but it cut through the air like a knife. He couldn't hold back the frustration any longer. Who is this? Chris looked between them, his easy smile fading as he took a step back, sensing the tension in the air. Laura, still trying to mask her unease, attempted to deflect the situation with a calmness that only made James more furious. This is Chris, Laura said, her tone overly casual, as if the circumstances were entirely normal. We've been working on a few projects together. He's a colleague from the conference. James raised an eyebrow, not buying her explanation for a second. A colleague? Something in her eyes betrayed her words. Laura couldn't even make eye contact with him as she spoke. Her story was unraveling in front of him, but James wasn't ready to hear more lies. I don't understand, he muttered, the weight of the situation sinking in. Why didn't you tell me about him? Why didn't you mention him before? Why is he here with you, at the airport, laughing and touching you like this? There was a long pause. Laura seemed to hesitate, the cracks in her calm facade becoming more apparent with each second. She tried to smooth it over with a half-hearted laugh, but it sounded forced, like she had rehearsed it too many times. James, it's not what you think, she began, her voice trembling slightly. Chris is a friend. We've been talking a lot about work, that's all. I promise, it's nothing. I didn't mean for this to look bad. You didn't mean for this to look bad? James's voice rose, but he quickly checked himself, trying to keep his composure. His mind was spinning, and the frustration was unbearable. You didn't mean for it to look bad. You're here, with him, acting like you're close. And you've been keeping it from me. Don't lie to me, Laura. I saw how he looked at you, how you looked at him. Chris's uncomfortable shift in his stance didn't go unnoticed. He was no longer grinning but standing there awkwardly, clearly caught between the two of them. He looked more like an intruder than a colleague now. James, listen, Laura began again, her voice cracking under the pressure. I never meant for this to happen. But there's something I need to tell you. I've been trying to figure out how to say this for a while. The words hung heavy in the air, and James's stomach clenched. He wanted to hear the truth, but at the same time, he was terrified of what it might be. He already knew deep down what was coming, but hearing it from her would make it all the more real. I'm having an affair, James, Laura finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. With Chris. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He felt the world spin around him as his chest constricted. An affair. She's been having an affair. The realization shattered whatever was left of his world. Everything he thought he knew about his marriage, everything he believed in, had been a lie. For a few moments, James didn't know how to respond. His heart hammered in his chest, and his hands started to shake. He tried to steady himself, but he couldn't. His wife, the woman he loved and trusted, had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. And now, standing in front of him, was the person who had been the cause of it all. Chris stood there, awkwardly silent, not knowing what to say. The hurt in James's eyes was unmistakable, and yet, Chris didn't offer an apology, didn't even seem to feel bad for the mess he had created. Laura, how could you? James whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. His voice trembled with a mixture of disbelief and anger. How could you do this to me? To us? Laura's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time since he'd walked into the airport, she seemed truly remorseful. I'm so sorry, James. I never meant for it to go this far, but I've felt so lost for a while now. The distance between us, it was getting worse. I felt like we were drifting apart, and Chris, he was there for me. We started talking, and it turned into something more. I never wanted to hurt you. Her words, though filled with guilt, didn't soften the blow. James was shaking now, his emotions a storm inside of him. She had been so close to this man, so open with him, and she never told me. His mind was filled with images of their life together, all the moments he thought were genuine, all the shared experiences that now seemed hollow. I didn't deserve this, Laura, he finally said, his voice low but steady. I trusted you. We've been together for years, and you've been lying to me. You've been with him behind my back, pretending everything was fine. And now you're telling me that you've been with him. How long, Laura? How long has this been going on? Laura winced at his words, her face crumpling with guilt, but she couldn't answer. She couldn't justify her actions, not when the truth was staring her in the face. She had chosen Chris, and now there was no way to turn back. Just when James thought he couldn't take any more, Chris spoke up, his voice breaking the silence that had settled over them. Look, man, Chris said, his tone defensive, I didn't mean for things to happen like this. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I never planned on this. But we couldn't stop it. It just happened. James's eyes narrowed, his gaze sharp as he turned to Chris. You didn't mean for it to happen, he scoffed. You didn't mean for it to happen. You've been with my wife for however long, and now you're telling me it wasn't planned? Get out of here. The tension in the air was unbearable. James felt as though his world had crumbled beneath his feet. All his plans, all his love, all the future they had talked about, it was all gone. He wasn't sure what to do next. The emotional impact was overwhelming. His head spun as he tried to process what had just been revealed to him. Laura was crying now, her body trembling with sobs. Chris stood awkwardly off to the side, no longer speaking. The damage had been done. And in that moment, James felt an overwhelming sense of finality. The relationship, the life he had built with Laura, was over. As he stood there, devastated, something deep inside of him shifted. He had been wrong to believe in this fairy tale. He had trusted her, loved her unconditionally, and this was the price he was paying. There was no coming back from this. The silence between them was deafening. James stood there, his heart heavy with a mixture of anger, disbelief, and an ache so deep it felt like it would swallow him whole. His wife, the woman he had shared so many years with, was standing before him, crying, not in sorrow for the pain she had caused, but in regret for the life she had chosen to walk away from. Chris, the man she had betrayed him with, was silently watching the scene unfold, as if waiting for something to happen, but unwilling to take the first step. James couldn't look at Laura anymore. Every tear that fell from her eyes only reminded him of the lies she had told, the moments she had shared with someone else while he had been kept in the dark, waiting for her to return home. The promise of their reunion now felt like a cruel joke. James, please, Laura sobbed, taking a step toward him, but he instinctively took a step back, his eyes cold, distant. I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. James shook his head slowly. But you did, Laura. You did hurt me. More than you can imagine. You let this happen. You let him in. His voice was tight, each word a punch to the gut, each syllable laced with the weight of betrayal. And I never saw it coming. All this time. I thought you loved me. I thought we had something real. Laura's face twisted in anguish. I do love you, James. I never stopped loving you. It's just. I've been so lost, and I made a mistake. I've made so many mistakes, and I'm sorry. But it's too late now. You can't just undo what I've done. The words hit him like a blow to the chest. It was the final realization that everything they had shared was a lie. She loved him, but not enough to be faithful. Not enough to fight for their marriage. And now, standing here, with Chris still by her side, there was nothing left to salvage. For a moment, James just stared at her, his chest tightening with every breath. He wanted to scream, to shout at her for the pain she had caused. But the words wouldn't come. He was too exhausted from the weight of it all. Too hurt to fight for someone who had already given up on him. "Are you going to leave me, too?" Laura whispered, her voice shaky, as if afraid to hear the answer. James took a deep breath. "I don't know." The honesty of the answer surprised him. He had always been sure that no matter what happened, he and Laura would work it out. But now, that certainty was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of doubt. He couldn't stay. Not like this. Not knowing that she had chosen someone else. The trust had been shattered, and he didn't know how to rebuild it. But at the same time, the idea of walking away felt like a defeat. The future they had planned was slipping through his fingers, and he didn't know how to let go. Chris, who had been eerily quiet this entire time, finally spoke, his voice low and almost apologetic. "James, I never meant for things to go this way. I never wanted to hurt you." James turned his gaze toward him, his eyes sharp. "Don't talk to me. You don't get to explain yourself. You knew what you were doing. Both of you did." Chris didn't argue. He just nodded, as though understanding that there was nothing left to say. His presence felt like an intrusion, an added layer of pain that James couldn't bear to look at. Laura stepped forward, reaching for James's hand, but he pulled away, his eyes hardening. The gesture, once so familiar, now felt foreign and insincere. There was nothing she could do to undo the damage. Nothing she could say that would make him forget what had happened here. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, her voice breaking. "I never meant to hurt you. I wish I could take it all back, but I can't. I know I've lost you." James's heart clenched at her words. "I've lost you." It was the truth, but hearing it from her lips felt like a final death sentence to everything they had shared. There was a long pause, and for a moment, James thought about what his future might look like. Could he ever forgive her? Could he ever trust her again? Could he even stand to be in the same room with Chris after what had transpired? The answer, he realized, was no. The trust between him and Laura had been broken beyond repair. He couldn't continue living in a lie, constantly wondering if there was more to the story. If he stayed, it would only be out of obligation, out of a sense of duty to the past they had once shared. But duty didn't heal wounds. It didn't fix betrayal. "Maybe it's time for both of us to move on," James said softly, the words carrying a weight he hadn't anticipated. He wasn't sure if he meant them for her, for himself, or for both of them. But the truth was, he couldn't keep living in a marriage built on lies. He couldn't keep pretending that things were okay when they were so far from it. Laura looked at him, her face full of pain and regret, but there was a small flicker of understanding in her eyes. She knew, just as he did, that this was the end. "I'm sorry, James," she whispered again. "I truly am." James turned away, his heart aching, but he couldn't stay here any longer. He couldn't keep looking at her and wondering what could have been. He needed space. He needed to heal. As he walked away, he didn't look back. He couldn't. The man he had been, the man who had believed in love and loyalty, was no longer the same. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that he had to find a way to move forward. Laura and Chris stood there, frozen in place, the shattered pieces of their lives scattered around them. The airport, once a place of reunions and joy, had become a symbol of betrayal. The future was uncertain, but the past was gone. The camera lingered on James's retreating figure as he stepped out of the terminal, leaving behind the woman he once loved and the life he thought he knew. The screen faded to black, leaving viewers to reflect on the complexity of love, loyalty, and forgiveness.